Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorius. There's something a little bit different here. I've been asked in the last 3 years or however long I've been working on my channel, I talk a lot about historical warfare and weapons and how different weapons are used. I regularly teach people how to use swords. I run a regular class in London, in the UK, and a lot of people come to me and they go, Matt, how do you think a lightsaber would be used? Now, first of all, I should say, I don't want to spoil anyone. So, if you're not up to date on Star Wars Rebels, then stop watching now, or probably you should have stopped even before this point. But what we're going to talk and what we're going to look at here is a little segment of the latest episode, latest as of filming this video, latest episode from Star Wars Rebels. Where Sabine gets given something called the Dark Saber, okay, which is a semi-mythical, turns out to be real, lightsaber that was essentially used by a Mandalorian Jedi. Now, I'm not going to go into any more of the Star Wars lore, apart from to say that I have actually attempted to film a video about how lightsabers may actually be used in the real world if they were a real thing. And it's very, very difficult. The reason it's very difficult is because the information that we get from different Star Wars sources, some of which are now non-canon, it has to be said, are to some degree slightly conflicting. Now, the first thing that we encounter is a lot of people argue that a lightsaber is light in terms of mass because it doesn't have a steel blade like a sword does, and therefore it can move incredibly quickly. In actual fact, if we take the films as the original canon, and in fact, of course, if we look at things like the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, the other canon that we have in the latest films, Force Awakens and Rogue One, well, obviously there's no lightsaber combat in Rogue One, but if we look at Force Awakens anyway, although in theory a laser, plasma, whatever it's supposed to be, going through a crystal producing a blade or focusing at a certain point to create a blade should have no mass, it's very clear that if we judge by our own eyes and the evidence of what we can see in the combat portrayed in these mediums, in these films and TV series, we can see that they move as if they have a mass. Now, therefore, because the lightsaber moves as if it has mass and seems to move through the air with some degree of resistance, it seems as though in reality they do move somewhat like actual steel swords. They seem to move at a similar speed to swords, and they seem to move in similar ways. And in actual fact, a friend of mine, shout out to Ty Harris, who hopefully is watching this video, when we tried to film this discussion, which for various reasons I didn't air, but when we tried to film this discussion between us previously, he pointed out that originally the theory behind lightsabers was that actually the device itself would be very heavy and would require two hands to actually move around and operate. Now, one of the problems, I think, with the reality of what we see when we watch Star Wars movies and the TV series is that what we see isn't the motion, isn't the movement, doesn't have the inertia, the physical inertia of an object that has all of its mass concentrated in the handle. If you imagine for a second a lightsaber handle, if you made it of solid lead, it would be very heavy. Heavier actually than a real sword is. Real swords, real long swords weigh, 3 or 4 pounds maximum usually when they're that kind of size. Now, if you had all of the mass concentrated in the handle, but no mass in the blade at all, it would move, the blade would move very, very quickly actually. It would require quite a bit of kind of strength and picking up momentum and inertia to move the weapon around at the handle end, but the tip end of the weapon would actually move very, very quickly, because what we call in fencing or in swordsmanship we call point of balance would be essentially in the handle. If the handle had all the mass and the blade had none of the mass, the point of balance would be somewhere in the handle and the blade would move incredibly quickly, despite the fact that the handle would be heavy. What we actually witness in the films and in the TV series is actually something that seems to have mass in the blade. It seems as if the point of balance is actually somewhere in the blade. Therefore, whatever the physics, whatever the real world explanation of it is, we have to interpret that as however a lightsaber could be made, the end result is an object that seems, visually and in terms of how you might feel it in your hand, seems to have mass in the blade. So when you swing the lightsaber, it's not like swinging something, it's not like moving a torch around where the light beam doesn't have any mass. You can't move it that quickly. In actual fact, it's very clear when they swing that the blade, as we'll call it here, it actually does have the equivalent of mass, or at least it moves in a way that looks like something that has mass. Now, looking at Star Wars Rebels, how does this relate? Well, the latest episode actually addresses this point, and it's fantastic. I couldn't believe it when I saw it, because I've had this discussion with friends of mine so many times, and it was actually fantastic to finally see, you know, confirmation that this is the case. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the clip and then we're going to talk a little bit about it.
Ignite the blade.
It's heavier than I thought.
Energy constantly flows through the crystal. You're not fighting with a simple blade as much as you are directing a current of power. Your thoughts, your actions, they become energy. They flow through the crystal as well and become a part of the blade.
So folks, there we have it. We have confirmation from Kanan himself that when ignited, the lightsaber blade seems to have a sort of inertia to it, essentially. And Sabine, when she ignites the blade, actually comments on how heavy it is. I think this is probably harking back to Lucas's original ideas of how he envisioned the lightsaber actually being. It's not a weightless object, it's not a light thing. Now, in terms of the science, I'm not even going to go there, because obviously what we're talking about here is science fiction, pseudoscience, and let's call it mumbo jumbo. It actually doesn't matter for the story, but what is important to answering the question of how a lightsaber would feel and how it moves, the answer is it feels and moves like a sword, which actually shouldn't be surprising to us, because that's exactly what we've seen right the way through the canon material of the Star Wars saga, is we've seen that lightsabers do in fact move, and they seem to have a mass and an inertia that is similar to a real sword. So that's absolutely fantastic that in Rebels they've actually addressed this point. And for me, it puts a cap on that whole debate, on that whole issue. This is it, they've answered the question here. It does feel and move like an actual sword. Now, one final point before we wrap this up. One of the other questions that comes up to me is in terms of the lightsaber fights. Very often we see when two blades come into contact with each other, we see that they almost stick together. Now, this is something that steel blades do not do. Steel blades, they can with a sharp edge bind together a little bit if the edge bites into the edge of the other sword, but by and large steel blades slide up and down each other more. Whereas we don't see that very much in lightsaber combat. Now, I've made the point in the past that to me one of the flaws of lightsabers is that they don't have a handguard. Because steel blades slide up and down each other, it's very important that we have a guard of some kind to protect our hands. However, lightsabers clearly don't usually have that, with the obvious exception in The Force Awakens. But if we put that one to the side, most lightsabers don't have a handguard, and I always saw this as a flaw before. However, if we actually look at the way that lightsaber combat is shown across the canon material, it seems that the blades stick together. And yet again, the writers of Star Wars Rebels have addressed that point. Let's see what Kanan says next.
The blades will be drawn to each other. Block high.
So there we have it, folks. It seems that indeed we've got confirmation that lightsaber blades, not only do they stick together a little bit, they almost have a magnetic attraction to each other. And that completely explains a lot of the techniques that we see in the original Star Wars trilogy and the subsequent prequels and everything else. It's absolutely, actually, I think, fantastic. Because for many of us who are interested in swordsmanship, we in the past have tried to explain some of the phenomenon and in fact some of the decisions they make about techniques in the Star Wars films, the prequels and the original trilogy and Force Awakens. And actually this explanation within really a few seconds has explained it all. We now know that lightsabers are supposed to move with inertia, they're supposed to have mass, so they move like a sword, but the blades do not slide up and down each other because the nature of those plasma blades means that they are attracted to each other and therefore slightly stick together. In the past, one of the common criticisms I've made about lightsaber combat has been that when they come into what we would call a bind, that is when the two blades are crossed and stuck together, often they'll get into a dialogue. That's a common thing we find in fencing scenes in Hollywood films. But my criticism was that there were lots of techniques with a sword that we would do from there that they don't generally do in the Star Wars trilogy. But the fact that the blades stick together slightly makes now a lot more sense of why they don't do that. So it's almost like they've been watching videos like mine and other people's and they've actually thought about this more critically. And this is absolutely fantastic, and as far as I'm concerned, this latest episode of Star Wars Rebels puts a lot of questions to rest and makes a lot more sense of the lightsaber combat that we see in all of the Star Wars films and the TV shows. Cheers for watching, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.